Good afternoon, or good morning, I should say. Does it sound okay? My name is Larry Few. I'm the director of the Global Affairs Center, and welcome to our first Globalize event of this quarter. We're really glad you're here, and we have a great turnout. So the format will be, Amy will speak for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and answers. So, but when we're doing the questions and answers, we do ask you to use a microphone just because we are recording the event, and we want to make sure that we pick everything up for the recording. Today's topic is the historical context for the debate over immigration policy that is currently taking place here in the United States. The topic, anti-immigration rhetoric, has filled the airwaves during the early months of this presidential campaign, especially since the Syrian refugees began pouring into Europe and terrorist attacks shook Paris, Beirut, and other places. But this anti-immigration rhetoric is not new, as you will find out during this presentation. Although the U.S. has welcomed millions of people to its shores, U.S. immigration and refugee policy has also served to shut the doors in many ways to tens of thousands of people seeking a safe haven. And despite being a nation of immigrants, or at least we say we are, Americans sometimes seem exceptionally hesitant to open our doors to others to allow them in. So what does this mixed open door and closed door history mean for the American economy, for our national security, and for U.S. sovereignty? Who has the right to keep others out? To discuss these and other questions about U.S. immigration policy, we're joined by Dr. Amy Kinsel, Dean of Social Sciences, Equity, and Social Justice, Library, and Parent and Child Center here at the college. Did I leave anyone out? That's pretty good. Okay. She began teaching American history here on the campus more than 10 years ago. I think it was in 2004. And during her faculty years, she developed and taught a multicultural studies course on U.S. immigration history. He wants me to move over here. Yes. She argues that today's immigration debate is not all that different from past immigration policies and debates that we had in this country, and that Americans today would benefit from understanding the historical context of the current debates. Her main focus in her own historical research and teaching has been how Americans remember the past and how they have shaped historical narratives to serve past and present political and cultural purposes. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Amy, and please let's give her a round of applause.
Okay, so immigration and refugees, go ahead. So as you probably are aware, the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, and this is a picture of some immigrants being sworn in as American citizens. So what I want to talk about today is some questions about how we think about immigration, how we think about the U.S. as a country of immigrants, who is and is not admitted, and why. So you can go ahead. Okay, so there are a number of ways to count immigrant status. So to think about immigration through numbers. So the U.S. Constitution has a provision for a census to be taken every 10 years. And that is to provide for representation in Congress, to make sure that the districts for congressional representation are even and that everybody's fairly represented. It also has the added functionality of telling us a lot about the American people. And beginning in the 19th century, the Census Bureau started asking a lot of questions about where people were from and that sort of thing. So we have a lot of data. So this raw data shows the numbers entering the U.S. from 1821 forward. So this means that there was a big increase in immigration and then a decline and then a subsequent big increase in immigration. So that looks like more immigrants than ever before. But in order to understand these numbers, it's really important to put them in historical context. So is it really more immigration than has ever entered the country before? What do you think?
Well, but the size of the country changed as well. So.
Right. The numbers of Americans overall changed, so the raw data on the number of immigrants entering could be affected by looking at percentages. Larry? Thank you. Okay, so the percentage of foreign-born is related to the overall population. So if you look at this graph, you have the percentage from 1910 to 2010. the percentage from 1850 forward. So as you see, there was a big increase in immigration following the United States Civil War. It reached as high as 15% of the population was foreign-born in 1910. In 2010, it's 13% of the population is foreign-born. So that context tells you that we do have right now a pretty high level of foreign-born people living in the United States. So what's happening with that big dip there? Why does that big dip occur? What can we learn about how the changes in the number and percentage of foreign-born are affected by policy decisions? Larry? So there's another way to look at immigration. That's where people are coming to the United States from. So this graph shows you the same years that appeared in the other graphs by place of origin. Europe, Asia, North America, that includes Mexico, South America, and Africa. So what are you noticing here?
They want people from Europe to want.
Yeah, there's that big peak of people from Europe right about 1910. And then what happens to that peak of people from Europe? It declines rather precipitously. Now, did that decline rather precipitously just because people stopped coming? Ah, okay, so we've got World War I, we've got the Great Depression, but there's also another factor. There's US law and US policy. So one thing to think about when you're thinking about immigration is how the United States government defines people. Defines people as citizens, defines people as aliens, defines people as eligible to be in immigration status, defines people to be eligible to become naturalized citizens. So it's not an accident. It isn't just the world changed and therefore that red line precipitously dropped. US policy changed. And those are decisions that are made in the political realm by Americans through their representation processes. What do we decide as Americans? What did the people before us decide as Americans was going to happen with US immigration policy? Larry? So there's a number of laws that I'm not going to be able to go through all of them. There's quite a long list. But just to get started here, the United States' first immigration-related law is the 1790 Naturalization Act, which says that free white persons, after they've resided in the United States for 2 years, are eligible to become naturalized citizens. So that's pretty clearly a racial distinction that existed for a very long time. The Alien and Sedition Acts I'm calling out because this is a question of security. The United States in the geopolitical context was having some disagreements with France during the 1790s, excuse me. The French were interdicting US merchant marine ships and seizing US vessels. So the American government didn't really appreciate that very much. But there were two factions in the American government. There were the Federalists, at this time led by President John Adams, and the Republicans, who bear no relation to the current Republican Party. And I don't have time to go into the various changes in the American political system, but those are not our Republicans today. They're the Republicans of Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson was vice president, Adams was president. Adams wanted to go to war with France, Jefferson did not. There was a big, big, big political divide. And this drawing here is called Congressional Pugilists, 1798. And this is a brawl on the floor of the House of Representatives over the Alien and Sedition Acts. So if you think politics is down and dirty today, this was actually a brawl. So Representative Roger Griswold of Connecticut attacked, he was a Federalist, he attacked the Republican representative from Vermont, Matthew Lyon, with his walking stick. So this is a hickory walking stick, which gentlemen carried around a lot and oftentimes became weapons. And Lyon, the Republican from Vermont, grabbed a pair of fire tongs, which you see here. He's got the fire tongs, and they're bashing away at each other on the House floor. And then all the other congressmen come into the fray, and there's a brawl on the House floor. So this came into the newspapers in the form of this political cartoon. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were designed to allow the US government to suppress support for France to expel, deport citizens of enemy countries. Those laws expired after much debate. You can go on. But there were other debates about immigration. Into the 19th century, there was an upswing in immigration from Ireland. Many of you have heard of the Irish potato famine. Refugees, we might call them, from Ireland came to the United States by the tens of thousands, and a great deal of opposition to this ensued. This is just a couple of examples, I'm moving really quickly here, of some of the debates over Irish immigration. And one of the biggest concerns of people opposed to Irish immigrants was that they were predominantly Catholic. The United States in the 1840s was a predominantly Protestant country, and these Catholics caused a lot of animosity and fear. The arrival of these Catholics caused a lot of anxiety among Protestants. So there was a political party formed called the Know Nothing Party in the 1840s and 50s. That's represented on the left by Citizen Know Nothing, who is the exemplar of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American. He's very Anglo-oriented, and he is the sort of image of the Know Nothing Party. I don't have time to go into why they call themselves the Know Nothings, but this is all during the period of time when the Whig Party is collapsing and splitting into factions. On the right is a cartoon by a famous editorial cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who drew for Harper's Weekly. This is from the 1870s. After the Civil War, after Irish immigrants have fought for the Union in the Civil War and established themselves as credible Americans, there is still vicious anti-immigrant imagery and rhetoric. What do you notice about the image of that Irish? Yeah, he's, what does he look like? He looks like an ape. This is very, very similar to images of African Americans at the time. So also this whole image here, who's that on the right? A priest. A bishop, actually. So killing the goose that laid the golden egg is the Democratic Party is the goose that laid the golden egg. All those eggs up in the corner there have things like public benefits and public jobs and public resources. So the idea is that the Irish immigrants have taken over municipal governments. They're running cities through the democratic machine. They're getting all the police jobs. They're getting all the fire jobs. They're getting all the benefits and the contracts and so forth and so on. And it's not fair to those Anglo-Americans on the left. Also, in terms of historical debate, economics plays a huge role in opposition to immigration. The Chinese started coming to the United States in significant numbers, well, actually rather small numbers, but to the Anglos who were in the United States, it seemed like significant numbers, particularly in the West Coast. First, for the gold rush in California, 1849. Then for construction of railroads. Then for other mining in the West, hard rock mining particularly, silver mining. The Chinese were well known for being able to use dynamite. They were available as laborers, particularly from southern China. And contractors went over and recruited them to come to the United States. One of the side stories of the Civil War is that all of the Southern congressmen and senators left Congress, and that allowed the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln to pass internal improvement legislation that resulted in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so in the West, the workers for the Transcontinental Railroad were many times Chinese immigrants. In the East, they were Irish immigrants. So this is a photograph of Chinese workers in the mines in California. And the image on the other side of the page is from a publication in San Francisco that was very popular at the time. The title of the publication is The WASP. What does WASP stand for? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the WASP is agitating for the Chinese to be excluded from immigration. So the donkey in there is a symbol of the Democratic Party, which represented workers. And unions and laborers were very opposed to Chinese immigration. Why? They thought that that was affecting their wage rates. They thought they were competing for jobs. And this came to a large head in the 1870s when there was a depression. At that time, economic depressions were called panics. And it was the Panic of 1873 that caused a lot of labor unions to oppose Chinese immigration. If you notice, on that left-hand diagram, which isn't very distinct from probably where you're sitting, there's all of these things that Chinese are doing, particularly in California. They're working in laundries, they're working in restaurants, they're working as coachmen, they're working as fishmongers, they're working in bathhouses. So the message of this is the Chinese must go. Yes, we agree. The Chinese there's too many Chinese people, but who keeps them? If people didn't keep hiring them, they wouldn't be here, right? So that same sort of message that we have today was present in the 1870s. Opposition to Chinese immigration from labor groups, particularly related to competition and lowering of wages. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of horrific images of Chinese immigrants not appearing as apes, but appearing as rats and living at the level of a rat. And that's the only way that they can sustain themselves at the abysmal wage rates that they accept and then undercut real American wages. Okay. So what happened, there was a bunch of violence against Chinese immigration. There was a riot in Seattle, a Chinese immigration riot in which white residents of Seattle attacked Chinese and expelled them from the city. This happened all over the West Coast. This is in Los Angeles here, where the white workers are attacking Chinese immigrants. So the Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which is the first real restriction on immigration to the United States, and it targeted a particular racial group. So there was a subsequent legislation. Now my point here is that whatever people at the time thought of Chinese as eligible to become US citizens, there was enough political opposition to the immigration of Chinese to restrict Chinese from continuing to come and to make it impossible for any Asian immigrant to become a US citizen through naturalization. You can go on. The next sort of big event in immigration is that there were religious exclusions and religious concerns. We already saw that with Irish, but it became even more pronounced in the late 19th century. Remember that huge upswing in the red line of European immigration. There were economic and political and military turmoil in Europe that caused millions of people to flee from places like Italy and Russia and Poland. And those were very different immigrants than had come in the 19th century and earlier. They were poorer, they were more rural, they were more Catholic, and they were Jewish. So these images here show opposition that occurred in the press, and these were similar in some ways to the opposition that we see in a different medium today to immigration. That's Colombia in the flag dress there. She's a symbol of the United States. And she's holding her hand up to stop these undesirable immigrants from coming in. And this is a political cartoon magazine called Judge. This is 1885. And you see the countries across the Atlantic Ocean. They're Germany and Italy and Russia. And all of those sort of undesirables are sort of crawling or swimming across the ocean to get to the United States. On the left, there's another image from the WASP, 1888. Who's that guy in the middle? What does he represent? He's the, you know, the rugged Western independent working man, and he's holding up an Italian immigrant and a Chinese immigrant. What is he going to do with them? Yeah, he's standing on a rock in the ocean. He wants to put them back in the ocean and drown them, right? This message is pretty clear. These are not desirable immigrants for the United States. And then the situation gets very anti-Semitic. This image on the left is also by a cartoonist named Frank Beard. It was published in another editorial cartoon newspaper called Ram's Horn. And the sort of vile anti-Semitic image of the Russian man coming. His bags say poverty, disease, anarchy, Sabbath desecration is on his back. So what does this remind you of? Are there any parallels in today's immigration discussion? Yes.
Well, pretty much everyone, there's a larger group of people in the United States who believe that Muslim is immigrants bring these types of things, these negative connotations.
Right, right. So the picture on the right is actually immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. The caption of the picture on the left was, "Can I come in?" asked the U.S. immigrant in the caption. Uncle Sam replies, "I suppose you can. There's no law to keep you out." So Uncle Sam is another representation of the U.S. So, of course, this was a great deal of political pressure that was compounded by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, by the developing politics of action, direct action through anarchist bombings. So there were a number of bombings and other events during what's called the Red Scare in the United States. Fewer than 40 bombings occurred throughout the whole world during this anarchist period, and fewer than 100 people were killed. But the press was whipping up anti-anarchist sentiment. This is a couple of examples of images of immigrants who are depicted as bomb throwers in the early 20th century. So this is right before additional restrictions on immigration. So on the left, this is from the Chicago Tribune and was republished in the Literary Digest. Close the gate. This is pressure to close immigration. And on the right, "Come unto me, ye oppressed." What is that a quotation from? The Statue of Liberty has this poem on it, you know, "Send me your tempest-tossed," and this is originally from the Memphis Commercial Appeal, reprinted in the Literary Digest. So these were kind of like the internet today. Something would be printed and then it would be passed on and reprinted in other publications and it would make its way all the way around the country. So the immigration restrictions that occurred in the early 20th century are what caused that precipitous decline that you saw in the red line on the graph. So the Emergency Quota Act, which is depicted on the right in this funnel. So you've got these millions of Europeans trying to come into this funnel, and the gate is going to limit them. So what this law did is it limited immigration based on a quota. 3% of the number of foreign-born persons by nationality could come in. So millions were trying to come in, and if there were, say, 50,000 people from, I don't know, Italy, what's 3% of that?
15,000.
Yeah, 1,500. So you go from 50,000 to 1,500. You've drastically reduced the number of people who can come into the country. So that was an emergency quota. In 1924, this is right after the end of the First World War, the National Origins Quota Act, the Johnson-Reed Act, limited it to 2%, but they went back to the census of 1890. What does that do? It's even smaller. So if the peak of immigration is 1910, right before World War I, and you set your percentages of immigrants allowed in at 2% of the level of foreign-born in 1890, that's an even smaller number, and it privileges Northern Europe more than Southern Europe, because most of the Southern and Eastern European arrivals came later. Okay, so what?
So it reminds you of climate change.
So one of the key things to notice in the 1924 National Origins Act is that it does not include the Western Hemisphere. Does not include South America, Central America, or Mexico, or Canada. There's no restrictions on any of those people entering the United States. There's no quota on those people. It only affects Asia and Europe, and Africa, which there wasn't significant African migration until after the end of the colonial period, but that's another topic. So can you click on that link? And this is going to open a teeny weeny box, and I told you that we'd have newsreels, so this is a newsreel. I hope it opens. Come on. It's turning. From the Detroit News. No, you can't. They're going back to the old country. This was silent shown in theaters. And so here's the federal officials in Detroit have apprehended 14 undocumented immigrants who've been in the country for 3 or 4 years. And so this is being shown in theaters. And here they are being rounded up, all aboard for the deportation train. Detroit is right across from Canada. So my suspicion is that they were deported to Canada. Okay, you can stop. This is okay, and then next slide. Okay, so Mexican immigrants, as I said, were not affected by the 1924 law. So there was a sort of free-flowing agricultural labor movement between Mexico and the United States. And there were quite a few people of Mexican descent in the western United States anyway, because the United States had annexed that part of Mexico after the Mexican-American War in 1848. So there's another event that occurs, one of you mentioned it before, is the Great Depression. During the 1930s, need for laborers went down. And there was a sort of roundups and expulsions, deportations of quite a number of Mexicans. So you can play that video now. This one should be bigger and should have sound.
By some estimates, almost 2 million individuals were deported from the United States in the 1930s. Some estimate that almost 60% of those that were deported were United States citizens. And they were deported for but one reason. They just happened to be of Mexican descent.
My dad left in 1936. When I was 10, I never saw my dad again. How is anybody going to compensate me for that loss?
We need to examine this part of our history because it's unfortunately not very well known. And as the old saying goes, for those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. And we have to ensure that never, ever will this happen again. But unfortunately, we are always very close to the line of watching it happen again and again.
This country is being invaded no less than if hordes of armed people came across its borders. This invasion is not armed, but they've got weapons. Weapons they use for their anchor babies.
Un aspirante a senador anunció una descabellada propuesta, la de negarle la ciudadanía a los bebés nacidos en Estados Unidos de padres indocumentados.
Most people, even all these guys that you mentioned that are now condemning what is going on, say nothing about what happened in the 1920s. Why? They don't know. They don't know. So I often tell my wife, one of the tragedies of being a historian is you know too damn much. You can never be happy if you're going to be a historian.
I had to include that part. That's it, yes. Okay, and we can go back. All right. Forward, yeah, those are railroad workers in California. So another big event that affected refugees. So one of the things that is important to understand about waves of refugees, movement of people, human migrations, there are a number of factors: religious persecution, war, economic deprivation, and political persecution. Those are some of the factors. So during the period of World War II, the United States needed laborers because They were going so far as to recruit women to work in factories, so of course they needed laborers. So the Bracero Agreement allows Mexicans to come into the United States to work as laborers. That program continued until the 1960s. The United States was allied with China against Japan. Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act was kind of an embarrassment in that case. So the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act and allowed Chinese immigrants to become citizens. I'm not going to go into Japanese internment. That's a whole different topic. But there were other changes as a result of the war. The War Brides Act in 1945 allowed servicemen to bring their spouses and children that they had acquired, if you will, while they were serving overseas into the country more easily. The Displaced Persons Act admitted a relatively tiny 200,000 refugees from Europe. And I put this picture of here of the SS St. Louis. The United States did not cover itself in glory in World War II in attempting to help and admit Jewish refugees from Nazism of any kind. This is a story of a ship that left Germany in 1939, hoping to resettle the 900 or plus refugees in Cuba. There were some tangles of diplomatic overtures and some misunderstandings, and the ship was not allowed to land in Cuba. There were ongoing negotiations to try to get the ship admitted to Cuba. There were desperate pleas to get the United States to accept these refugees. The ship sailed within sight of the Florida coastline with people pleading to let those refugees come into the United States, some 940 of them. They were sent back to Europe for failure to land. The British took some, the French took some, but of course France was overrun by the Nazis shortly thereafter, and many of the people who were on that ship did not survive the Nazi occupation of France. And I merely mention this because the United States has not, in that case, did not do a very stellar job of accepting refugees. But in terms of immigration policy, as I've tried to say, it depends on what the actual law is that applies to each individual. So in the 1950s, again, there was a need for agricultural labor in the 1950s in the United States. The ready available laborers were Mexicans. Some of them could come in. Other Mexicans were expelled. So we have two short, Larry, can you play those? These don't have sound. They originally did have sound, the first one, but they don't have sound. I don't know what happened to the sound. These were newsreels played in theaters. You need to click on the arrow. Can you move the arrow? Okay, so these are Mexicans, the Good Neighbor Labor Supply. They're being admitted through this Good Neighbor Labor Supply policy. And the text is in Texas. Restrictions are eased to permit the entry of Mexican farm labor for work under international agreement and contracts. Once illegal entrants may now work for specified periods on valuable crops. So this is an economic program, and you'll see the crops in a minute. So they're being admitted, they're being documented. This is a pro-immigration video. There's the crops that are going to be able to be harvested and so forth because of this policy in Texas. These immigrants are coming into Texas. And this is going to end in about 3 seconds. Okay, you can stop this one. Okay, but over in California, in 1954, we have wetback Roundup. This is another newsreel that was shown in theaters. And televisions are becoming popular, but not everybody has a television. So you want to play this one? No sound. I don't know what became of the sound. There would have been sound. So hundreds of alien workers rounded up. This is 4 years later in California, and the text that comes with this video is an intensive wetback roundup of the latest episode in the Immigration Department's incessant battle against migrant laborers who illegally ford the Rio Grande to work in the rich farmlands around Stockton. So this video, this newsreel, shows immigrants being deported. They're being searched. And Immigration authorities, look at they're searching in people's pens, they're searching all over the place. So the immigration department is going to load them onto a bus and ship them back. So that bus says Department of Justice on the side. Okay, you can end that one. And go on to the next slide. So the point here is that which group of Mexicans has the right to be in the United States? The ones who come into Texas under legal status to do agricultural work, the ones who come into California under illegal status to do agricultural work. It all depends on the law, which is a political conversation and a political act in the United States. There's no inherent right or wrong here. It's all dependent on the political circumstances of the time that generate the legal framework for immigration. So the United States the government was chagrined in some senses over its failure to admit refugees during World War II. So there were some changes to law that allowed immigration. I'm not going to be able to go into what happened with the Korean War. There were some Korean immigrants who came in at the time of the US involvement in the Korean War. But the biggest change occurred in the context of the Cold War that followed World War II with Cubans. The 1962 Migration and Refugee Assistance Act is specifically addressing Cuban migration in the wake of the Cuban Revolution. And the 1975 Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act allows individuals fleeing Southeast Asia to come to the United States. Now, in Cuba, the United States had attempted to intervene. You've heard of the Bay of Pigs, I hope, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this was in the Kennedy administration. The United States had attempted to intervene in Cuba, and Castro was still in power. The US has an embargo against Cuba. It's admitting practically anybody who flees from Cuba into the United States. The United States intervenes in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s and becomes very much involved in the war in Vietnam. So can you play this clip here? This is from 60 Minutes. This is reporter Ed Bradley, and you'll see him in the video. This does have sound.
At first, it's hard to make out. A speck on the horizon. You take a closer look. A boat. A flag. An arm waving. A crowd gathers along.
No, that's fine. The United States did accept roughly 1 million refugees from Southeast Asia between 1970 and 1992. 120,000 from Thailand, 140,000 from Cambodia, 190,000 from Laos, and 550,000 from Vietnam. Because of changes to US immigration policy regarding who is eligible to enter the United States after the 1965 Immigration Act, the demographics of the United States changed pretty significantly as a result of that influx. So on the left here is a graphic of refugees over time and where they've come from, significant numbers from Asia, and refugees geographically. So it's not distributed across the United States evenly. Washington State is one of the states that has a higher number of refugees than other states. You can go on. Quickly, the reason that immigration law matters so much, remember we had 1924, that quota system. The quota system was abolished in 1965 when the Hart-Celler Act replaced it. And this law prioritized immigration for immediate family members of people already living in the United States to reunify families. It establishes a cap for the first time on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, that is primarily Mexico. And it also provides for preferential admission based on employment needs. This is where we get the visas for employees like Microsoft who want to bring people into work. So the change in 1965 really affected the demographics of the country because the people who got in under those provisions were more often not white than white, except for the employment categories. And then that cap on immigration from Mexico particularly didn't prevent workers from coming back and forth across the Mexican border as they had for generations. Farm labor is not an easy commodity to come by in the West for a lot of landowners. And they relied on Mexicans to be seasonal workers. So those people who came, some of them stayed. So by 1986, there were millions of undocumented Hispanic laborers in the United States. The 1986 Act, which was passed under Ronald Reagan, provides for a 50% increase in border control, but it also provided a legalization process under which 2.7 million undocumented workers became lawful permanent residents. You can go on. So this is the demographics that have changed in the United States. This is Texas. So in a state like Texas, which has quite a significant proportion of immigrants, whites are now in the minority. That's the blue on the bottom. And this is a very significant change to people's perception of immigration. And I wanted to show this to you just because if you look at the national statistics, you can say, oh, well, you know, there hasn't been that great of a change. It's only a little bit. But if you look at state statistics, particular states, the perception of Anglo-Americans is that they're being overwhelmed by non-white immigrants and that their country is being taken over. So some of the political rhetoric that you hear today does have a basis in lived experience. If you look from 1960, when almost 74% of the population of Texas is white, to today, when only 1/3 of the Texans are white. You can go on. So the recent history of immigration, there's been much talk about reforming immigration, addressing undocumented workers, but what has happened, particularly since 2001, is a real crackdown on immigration, and that it's made it much more difficult to get legal status, to have to carry papers, to make it more difficult to go back and forth between Mexico and the United States and Central America and the United States, and has not really addressed the undocumented problem. Okay, so I didn't leave question time. I apologize for that. But I do have time to stay if anybody wants to ask questions. I think that the point that I want you to be aware of is that the policies that affect immigration are our choice as a country. There's nothing right or wrong. There's nothing built in or left out that we don't create ourselves. So the choice is, do we let in refugees? Do we not let in refugees? Do we have an expansive policy that welcomes people as we did in the past? Do we restrict people? So this is a bunch of immigrants and in various circumstances throughout the time period we've discussed. And I do have time to answer questions if you have any.
Can we keep the cameras running? Okay. We have time for, Amy's willing to stay here for a few minutes. I know that some folks have to leave for class, but feel free to leave. But if you do have to leave, thank you very, very much. And please, let's give her a round of applause. We will take some questions now. If you thought this was a great program, there are more like it coming up, and they're on page 3 of the program that you have. There's a list of events that are coming up. This is the first one in the series. Also, there's a chance for you to give some feedback. There's a form there asking you what you thought of this event. Would you like to see other events? Different topics? Let us know. We love to have feedback. And last thing I'll say, and I'm going to turn it back to Amy, is anybody who needs a paper signed for credit, come see me at the end. Okay, thank you very much. Amy, take it away. No!
Microphone.
Treat's pulling forward. He has a microphone, and And just so we make sure that we pick up the sound, if you have a question, raise your hand, and he'll bring the microphone to you. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Olga. There's been recently discussion about Washington State trying not to implement the Real ID Act. What do you think about this topic? What do you think about the Real ID Act as an act as well?
Well, I have my personal opinion, but I'm not here to give my personal opinion. I'm here to talk about historical context. The difficulty that states have with the Real ID Act is it's enforcing a provision of federal law through state actions. And there's a real tension in history between what the federal government wants to have happen and what the states want to have happen. So the tension is that the states have an interest in having people have driver's licenses and have driver's ID and have, be eligible to drive, whether those people are legal residents or not. So there's that interest at the state level. The interest at the federal level is to secure the country from non-documented, undocumented people. So the interests of the two conflict to some extent. So the federal government is sort of browbeating the states to implement federal policy, to enforce federal policy. And this happens repeatedly in various instances. You're all, I think, mostly too young to remember the debate over the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. So does anybody here remember the debate over the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit? So the federal government at one time imposed a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on all highways, but the speed limits are set locally, and some states resisted, and the federal government used its power of the purse to withhold highway funds from any state that didn't lower its speed limit to 55. This was during the time of the energy crisis in the 1970s and concerns about auto safety and accident and so forth and so on. Those are all politically charged decisions. So in terms of the Real ID, Washington State is going to lose its exemption in 2 years. So if we don't have enhanced driver's license in the state of Washington, we won't be able to use them as ID when we go through checkpoints at airports. And so there's this tension that's being created by the federal government and the state government disagreeing about the purpose of the driver's license.
All the citizens can get enhanced driver's license.
Yes.
Lawfully permanent residents can't.
Right. So that's going to present a real difficulty. So it remains to be seen whether or not it's going to be something that the federal government is going to be willing to follow through with. Does the federal government want to have undocumented residents be unable to fly? So it's increasing the number of people on essentially on a no-fly list. So it's not clear what's exactly going to happen. There's a 2-year window now. There will be presidential. I don't know what happened. And the situation is fluid at the moment. So there's this. They're buying time, so to speak, with the 2-year window, because there are 22 states that haven't implemented the Real ID. In those 22 states, are all of those undocumented people never going to be able to fly? That's the question. Yes.
So, Dr. Kinsel, my first question is, do you feel the American Safe Act that at least the Congress is debating right now, because the Senate's yet to vote on it, the latest vein of some of these anti-immigrant legislations of the past?
What is your question?
About like the American Safe Act, do you feel it's in the same vein as those that
it follows a cycle of ups and downs with immigration, and it's pretty clearly one of a cycle of patterns that we see in American history. Historians don't like to use history to predict the future, but you can see analogies to who is and is not a desirable American. So excluding particular types of immigrants has a history in the United States. So it's not like this is something that hasn't ever happened before, or that people haven't ever debated whether or not certain groups of immigrants should be excluded. So it does follow along what has happened before.
And the other question I have is, do you feel with the whole immigration laws, with the fact that we have now conflicting things between cities and states and federal about Syrian refugees and how they're being affected? Because some states where the governors are saying no way to refugees, but certain big cities are like, yes, we'll welcome refugees.
Well, again, the Constitution is clear. Immigration policy rests with the federal government. States do not have the ability to exclude people. The Commerce Clause would make no sense if free movement of people and goods across state borders could not occur. So while the governors of certain states can say we don't want any Syrian refugees, as a practical matter, that's not enforceable under the federal Constitution. Whether cities can then also say we're going to provide safe haven for people that the federal government wants to arrest and deport, that's another conflict between jurisdictions. And the Constitution is absolutely clear that immigration policy is a federal policy. That's why using state ID to enforce a federal policy is problematic, because the immigration and naturalization is a federal policy under the Constitution.
We're seeing some significant delay. Some people are seeing some significant delays with processing of some cases through USCIS. Do you think it might be caused not only by budget constraints, but some other, I don't know, things?
Sure. The executive branch has its processes. I mean, if they can expedite refugee status for Cubans in 1962, they could expedite refugee status for Syrians today. But it's all a political choice. So what does the executive branch direct the Immigration Service to do? And immigration moved to Homeland Security, so it's all tied up with the Patriot Act and the creation of the Homeland Security Department. So yeah, these are all political decisions. Whether you have an administration that favors easier access to refugee status or an administration that opposes it. What's the situation in Congress? Is there pressure from Congress not to fund certain provisions of refugee law that would provide support to refugees once they are settled in a particular place? So it's all a matter of political decision making. So I don't know the particulars of the slowdowns in achieving refugee status and entering the country, but the current federal government is under a lot of pressure to prove that it's done every single thing it possibly could to prevent one of those bomb-throwing terrorists from entering the country. So this is very similar to what was happening during the Red Scare in 1919, when the press, particularly the Hearst newspapers, were just publishing hysterical articles about the dangers of immigrants from places like Russia. So whether or not there's a fact to the danger is in some senses less important than the image and the rhetoric and the hype around whether there's a danger.
Any other questions?
One more.
One more. Last question.
How can we get involved with helping the refugees?
That's a good question. There are local agencies that are helping refugees who've settled in the Puget Sound region. And I may be able to give Larry some information about that. And through the political process, if you're interested in changing national policy, the congressional election is really important. The presidential election is important. Those are the people who make the decisions at the national level. So political involvement, voting for Congress and Senate and the president, but then also local communities have a great deal of influence in whether they help. There's societies, there's agencies, there's NGOs, non-governmental agencies, organizations that assist refugees in local communities. Okay.
Thank you very much, Amy. If you go to the GAC website, which is www.shoreline.edu/GAC, in about an hour's time, you will see some links to organizations around town that work with refugees. I heard you say specifically Syrian?
Well, any refugee, but there is a lot of that nowadays where...
There's one organization in town in particular that is a bit of a clearinghouse.
Right.
We'll have that information posted very shortly.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very, very much.